The eggs were still warm in the pan when the knock came. Not a neighbor, not a delivery driver. Standing on Ryan Calloway's porch, rain-soaked, unannounced, with no umbrella and no rehearsed politeness, was Natalie Cross, the woman who owned the granite mansion across Hartwell Street. The woman whose black iron gate had never once swung open in his direction in 2 years of living close enough to hear each other's silence. She was worth more than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. He fixed broken pipes and stuck hinges for cash. And yet, there she stood, jaw set, eyes stripped of every layer of control she was famous for. The most powerful woman on the block, standing in the November rain like someone who had run out of walls to hide behind. Ryan didn't know it yet, but what she needed no amount of money had ever been able to build. Ryan Calloway had a rule about his hands. They were allowed to fix things: pipes, hinges, circuit breakers, the rusted latch on old Mrs. Peller's garden gate 2 doors down. They were allowed to crack eggs on a Tuesday evening, while Emma sat at the kitchen table doing homework she didn't need help with, but liked having company for. They were allowed to do small, contained, manageable work, the kind where the stakes were low enough that a mistake meant an extra 30 minutes, not a $5 million loss, and a termination letter left on a desk. What they were not allowed to do was the other thing. The thing he was actually good at. He'd made that decision 4 years ago quietly and without ceremony, the way a man puts away a tool he no longer trusts himself to use carefully. The talent was still there. He could feel it sometimes, the way you feel an old injury in cold weather. That particular kind of thinking, the ability to look at a system and see exactly where it would fail before it did. At Vantex Industrial Group, they had called it instinct. They had promoted him for it, trusted him with it, asked him to sign off on things with it. And then, when the Cascade failure burned through $5 million and triggered federal penalties, they handed him a box and thanked him for his service. He had sent 2 written warnings, 4 weeks before the collapse, detailed, documented, carbon copied. Nobody had read them, but his name was on the final maintenance approval form, and in the end, that was the only document anyone needed. His marriage didn't survive the year that followed, not because of anger, but because of the quieter damage 2 people who had grown too far apart to remember how to come back. His ex-wife moved to Seattle. Emma stayed with Ryan because Emma had always been more his than the job, more his than the marriage, more his than anything he'd lost. Her mother called on weekends when she remembered. They moved to a 2-bedroom rental on Hartwell Street, Portland. The roof leaked in one corner of the living room. The furnace made a sound every morning like it was reconsidering its choices. The driveway had a crack running diagonally across it that Ryan kept meaning to fill and never did. He took on handyman work, the kind that neighbors described as whatever needs fixing, and paid for in cash and sometimes in pie. He charged less than he should have. He did better work than anyone expected. He never promised what he couldn't deliver. The neighbors called him the fix-it guy with the particular warmth people reserved for useful things rather than people. Ryan didn't take offense. He had chosen this deliberately. Small work, low risk. No one got hurt if he miscalculated. Emma did not see her father this way. To Emma Calloway, age 7, Ryan was simply the smartest person in the world, stated as fact, without qualification, with the absolute certainty of someone who had not yet learned to doubt the people they loved most. She said it the way other children stated that the sky was blue or that dinosaurs were real. Ryan kept that particular belief somewhere safer than anything else he owned. Directly across Hartwell Street, separated by 40 feet of asphalt, and a world that might as well have been measured in light years, sat number 12. 4 large properties occupied that side of the block, each set behind, wrought iron fencing and security cameras angled to catch everything and share nothing. Number 12 was the one that looked least like a home gray granite exterior, black gate windows that reflected the street back at itself. It was the kind of house that communicated its value without asking to be admired, clean, precise, and entirely self-contained. Natalie Cross had lived there for 2 years. She was 27 years old. She had inherited controlling shares of Cross Venture Capital at 24, when her father's sudden illness made the transfer a matter of urgency, rather than planning. The financial press had expected her to stumble. She was too young. They said too untested, operating in a market that did not accommodate people who still had things to learn. Instead, she spent 3 years restructuring the firm's entire portfolio. She acquired 4 failing companies, stripped them to their operational cores, rebuilt them, and sold them at margins that made analysts revise their language about what a 27-year-old was capable of. One profile described her as cold-disciplined and allergic to error. She had cut the article out and kept it not as vanity, but as a reminder of the standard she'd set for herself. On Hartwell Street, she was simply the woman behind the black gate. Gray Car No Wave never attended the block's annual summer cookout. Not arrogance, she genuinely did not know how to belong to a place that wasn't a boardroom. She had learned to occupy spaces. She had not yet learned to inhabit them. Ryan had noticed her, the way you notice weather, not with interest, but with the passive awareness of someone who spends a lot of time outdoors. He had seen her leave early and return late. He had seen her stand on her front steps some evenings, looking at nothing in particular, with the posture of someone doing calculations in her head. He had never spoken to her. He had assumed he never would. Then came the Thursday evening in late October, when everything changed, though it didn't look like change at first. It looked like a firmware notification. Natalie's integrated smart security system, custom designed by a boutique tech firm that had since dissolved, flagged a routine update. She approved it the way she approved everything quickly, after scanning the relevant details, trusting the architecture to do what architecture was supposed to do. 40 minutes later, the entire control panel went dark. Access control cameras, electronic locks, central climate dead. Not malfunctioning, not error looping. Simply gone, as if the system had decided to stop existing. She called 2 technical contractors. They arrived within the hour, examined the hardware, and delivered the same verdict, with slightly different phrasing. Proprietary system, no surviving documentation from the manufacturer, no diagnostic pathway they could trace. One quoted her a full hardware replacement, 6 figures, 2 weeks minimum. Natalie had a client arriving at 8 the following morning, a client whose confidence in her depended in ways both practical and symbolic on everything functioning exactly as it should. She stood on her front steps in the October dark, thinking through options, and finding the list shorter than she was accustomed to. Across the street, the kitchen light at number 7 was on warm and yellow against the gray night, the kind of light that meant someone was home and had been there long enough to make it feel that way. She had watched Ryan Calloway for 2 years without meaning to. She had watched him fix things that the people who owned them had already decided were beyond fixing. A furnace 3 houses down that 2 technicians had declared dead. A gate mechanism that had been stuck open for weeks before he spent 40 minutes on it, with tools she didn't recognize. She had filed these observations away the way she filed everything, not sentimentally, but accurately. He fixed things other people said couldn't be fixed. Natalie put on her blazer, walked through the rain without an umbrella, and knocked on his door. Ryan answered it, still holding the spatula. She told him what had happened cleanly without embellishment, the way she gave information in meetings. The system, the update, the contractors, the timeline. She watched his expression while she talked, and she could see the exact moment he understood what she was describing. Not the surface facts, the underlying architecture. His eyes shifted in a way that meant his mind had already started moving through the problem before she'd finished presenting it. Then something closed in his face. "I don't do that kind of work," he said. His voice was even. Not rude, not apologetic, just a door clearly marked. Natalie had not expected that. She had expected negotiation. She had expected a number. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded from somewhere down the hallway, small, unhurried, completely unconcerned with the situation at the door. Emma appeared in the corridor 7 years old, in a striped shirt holding a book against her chest, and regarding the stranger on the porch with the frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. She glanced at the woman, then she looked at her father. "Dad," Emma said simply, "you always fix things. You just do." Not encouragement, not strategy, just a fact, delivered by someone who did not understand why it would need stating. Ryan looked at his daughter for a long moment. The spatula was still in his hand. The rain was still falling. Natalie Cross was still standing on his porch, with the expression of someone who had come to the end of a very long list and found nothing left on it. He looked back at Natalie. "I won't take payment if it doesn't run again," he said. "That's the only condition I have." Natalie gave a single nod. No relief visible. No gratitude performed. Just acknowledgement, clean and direct the way she operated when something mattered enough to be treated honestly. Ryan set the spatula down on the entryway table, told Emma he'd be across the street, and stepped out into the rain. He did not yet know what he would find inside that control room. He did not yet know whose name he would eventually have to say out loud in a room full of people who had decided it was easier to forget. He only knew that he had made a promise to a neighbor he didn't know in a rain-soaked doorway because his 7-year-old daughter had stated a simple truth with the kind of certainty that made refusal feel like a lie. He walked across Hartwell Street. The black gate swung open ahead of him. The control room was smaller than Ryan expected, a narrow space off the main hallway lined with hardware panels that hummed with residual power even in their failed state. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked dark. He set his tablet on the work surface and started at the beginning the way he always had. Not with assumptions, but with what he could actually see. The hardware was intact. Voltage levels normal across every input he could reach. No burned components, no severed connections, no physical evidence of anything wrong at all. Whatever had happened here hadn't touched the machinery. It had gone somewhere deeper. He opened the diagnostic software he'd built during his last year at Vantex offline, self-contained, written for exactly this kind of situation, where the documentation didn't exist, and the system had to be read like a language you'd never been formally taught. He hadn't opened it in 4 years. It loaded the same way it always had, patient and precise waiting. Natalie stood in the doorway. She didn't ask questions. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance or anxiety, or the particular kind of nervous talking that people did when they felt useless and wanted to seem otherwise. She simply watched, and Ryan noticed that the discipline of it rarer than people realized. He worked through the process tree branch by branch, building a map of the system's logic in his head, the way he used to build them on paper at Vantex, holding the full architecture in memory, while checking each individual node, never losing the shape of the whole, while he examined the parts. It was slow work. It was the only kind of work that didn't lie to you. 40 minutes in, he found it. It was buried in the second layer of the authentication sub-process, not in the firmware update, not in any component the contractors would have thought to examine. A segment of code written by hand, inserted manually, with enough technical fluency to make it read like original architecture until the update came along and pulled the pin. Someone had built a trap inside the system and then simply waited for the right trigger to set it off. Ryan sat back from the panel. "This system didn't fail because of the update," he said, turning to look at Natalie directly for the first time since he'd walked through her door. "Someone planted a trigger inside it. The update was just the detonator." Natalie didn't react with alarm. She processed he could see it the way her expression went still and inward in the manner of someone reclassifying a situation rather than being surprised by it. "How long has it been there?" she asked. "Long enough to look natural. Whoever wrote it knew the system well." She moved into the room, then standing beside him to look at the screen. Up close, Ryan noticed for the first time that she looked tired, not physically, but in the way of someone who had been managing something heavy for a long time without putting it down. "That means," she said quietly, "that someone with access to this system decided to use it." Yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The rain pressed against the window at the end of the hall. It was Natalie who broke the quiet, not with alarm, but with the particular directness of someone who had decided that whatever came next, she would rather know it than not. She asked him how he'd known what to look for, how he'd known the system at all. Ryan told her about Vantex. He told it the way you recounted something you'd already made peace with, factually, without performing either bitterness or resolution. The automation systems, the cascade failure, the 2 written warnings nobody read, and the maintenance approval form with his name at the bottom, and the box they handed him on a Thursday afternoon, without a hearing or a severance package worth mentioning. He didn't editorialize. He let the sequence speak. Natalie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for several seconds. Not the quiet of someone searching for a response, but of someone whose mind had just connected something. "I acquired the remaining assets of Vantex 14 months ago," she said. "I have their complete internal records." Ryan looked at her. "There's a name in those records," she continued. "Dennis Holt, Chief Operating Officer at the time of the Cascade failure. He approved the budget cuts that created the maintenance gap. He was never disciplined. He was transferred into my organization after the acquisition, and he's been running critical infrastructure ever since." The rain was the only sound in the room. Ryan understood what she was telling him without her having to say the rest of it. The man who had made the decision that broke the system, the man who had then helped shape the narrative that made Ryan the responsible party, was sitting in a position of authority inside her company. Had been, for over a year, while Ryan fixed door hinges across the street. "Remove the trap," Natalie said. Her voice was level. "I'll handle the rest." Ryan turned back to the panel and did exactly that. 3 days later, a message arrived from Emma's school. Ryan was at a neighbor's house replacing a section of copper pipe when his phone buzzed the school's number mid-morning, which meant it wasn't administrative. He drove there in under 10 minutes, still with traces of joint compound on his forearm. Emma was sitting in the front office with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes aimed at a spot on the wall that wasn't anything in particular. She had the look of someone working very hard not to cry, which in Ryan's experience meant she was angrier than she was sad. He sat down beside her. She told him what had happened at recess. A boy named Jake, older louder, the kind of kid who had learned that cruelty delivered as a joke was harder to report, had said, in front of a group that Emma's dad only fixed broken things because he had broken something important once, and nobody trusted him with real work anymore. He said it like it was funny. Emma had shoved him hard enough to knock him back 2 steps. Ryan kept his voice steady. "You pushed him because he was talking about me." Emma unfolded her arms. She looked at him the way she sometimes did, directly, with the uncomplicated clarity that made him feel occasionally like she understood things he'd spent years avoiding. "I pushed him," she said, "because he said it like I should be embarrassed about you." A beat. "I'm not embarrassed about you." Ryan didn't answer right away. He let her words settle into the place they belonged, somewhere in the chest, heavy and luminous, at once the particular weight that only children could place in you. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without making a thing of it. On the drive home with Emma, quiet in the passenger seat, watching the street go by, Ryan found himself turning a question over that he hadn't allowed himself to ask in 4 years. The silence he had chosen, the small work, the low stakes, the careful containment of everything he was actually capable of. He had told himself it was peace. He had told himself it was the responsible choice. After what happened, the mature recognition that some tools were better left unused. But Emma had just defended him to a child who repeated what adults had decided was the acceptable version of the story, and the real version, the one with 2 written warnings and a decision made above his pay grade, was sitting in a filing cabinet across the street, inside the house of a woman who had read it. For the first time the question had an answer he didn't feel afraid to look at. Natalie called on Sunday. No opening pleasantries, Ryan had already noticed. This was simply how she operated, not coldness, but economy, the habit of someone for whom every sentence was a considered expenditure. "I need you at a board review on Wednesday," she said. "I've gone through the full Vantex records. The documentation supports everything you described, the warnings, the chain of communication afterward, the way the incident was characterized in the investigation. Your account of Cascade is the only piece that isn't in the file. Dennis Holt has been sitting in a position of authority over critical infrastructure on the back of your career." Ryan was standing in his kitchen. Behind him, Emma was eating cereal at the tablespoon, scraping the bowl in the unhurried rhythm of a child with nowhere to be. "I don't want to be part of a boardroom process," he said. "I understand that." Natalie's voice didn't soften exactly, but it slowed a deliberate shift, like someone choosing their footing on uneven ground. "You don't have to do this for yourself. Say what happened at Cascade and why. That's what you know better than anyone in that room." Ryan looked down at the coffee cup in his hand. Steam rising, going nowhere. She was right, not in the way that people were right when they were trying to persuade you, but in the way that true things were right, regardless of what you wanted to do with them. He knew the Cascade failure the way he knew the inside of any system he'd worked on, completely structurally without gaps. He had known it was coming. He had documented that he knew. And for 4 years, that knowledge had sat in him like an unread file, present, accurate, and entirely without consequence. He set the cup down on the counter. "What time on Wednesday?" he asked. Across the kitchen, Emma looked up from her cereal, read something in her father's posture that she didn't have language for yet, and went back to eating. But she was smiling just slightly at the bowl, at nothing in particular, as if she'd known all along that this was simply the next thing, and it was about time. The conference room on the 16th floor of Cross Venture Capital's Portland headquarters had the particular quality of spaces designed to communicate authority without appearing to try. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a table long enough that the people at opposite ends had to raise their voices slightly. 9 chairs, 9 people, and a view of the city that made everything below look like it was operating at a manageable scale. Ryan had worn the same jacket he wore to parent-teacher conferences. It was the best one he owned. He sat where Natalie had indicated, midway down the table beside a folder he recognized as his own documentation, printed and organized, with the kind of precision that suggested someone had gone through it more than once. Dennis Holt sat across, and 2 seats down, silver-haired, dark suit, with the settled posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this, and had never once been made to feel like the subject of the conversation. Natalie opened the meeting with the measured neutrality of someone who had decided that the most powerful thing she could bring into this room was the appearance of having no stake in the outcome. This was a systems integrity review, she said, related to the Vantex acquisition, specifically the Cascade incident and the documentation surrounding it. She did not introduce Ryan by title or role. She placed his folder on the table and let the room read. Then she nodded to him. Ryan spoke for 35 minutes. He did not perform it. He did not arrange his face into the expression of a man who had been wronged and wanted acknowledgement. He simply described the system, the automation architecture at Vantex, the specific vulnerability created by the budget reduction that Holt had approved 18 months before the failure, the sequence of events on the day of the Cascade incident, and the 2 written warnings he had submitted 4 weeks prior to the collapse with dates, recipient names, and the internal routing trail that showed exactly where they had gone and stopped. Then he walked through the communication records from the weeks following the incident, a thread of internal messages between Holt and Ryan's direct supervisor that read, when placed in sequence, not like 2 people investigating a failure, but like two people deciding how to describe one. He didn't editorialize. He didn't conclude. He laid the architecture of what had happened in the same language he would have used to describe any other failed system, and he let the structure speak for itself. Holt tried to interrupt twice. The first time, Ryan simply continued, not raising his voice, not acknowledging the interruption, just keeping the thread intact, the way you kept a hand on a loose wire you hadn't finished tracing. The second time, Natalie spoke before Ryan needed to. Let him finish. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It closed the space around Holt's objection the way a door closes, not loudly, but completely. When Ryan reached the end, he closed the folder and set his hands flat on the table. The room was quiet in the way rooms went quiet, when everyone in them had arrived at the same understanding, and no one was quite ready to be the first to say it aloud. Natalie turned toward Holt. The cascade failure was not caused by a maintenance error, she said. It was caused by a resourcing decision made above the engineering level, a decision that had been flagged in writing by the engineer responsible for the system. That warning was not acted on. When the failure occurred, the incident was characterized in a way that directed accountability away from the decision and toward the documentation. The engineer lost his position. The people who made the causal decisions did not. A beat. That is the finding. Holt's expression didn't collapse. Men like him didn't collapse in rooms like this. They had too much practice at the controlled retreat, the managed withdrawal. But something went out of his eyes. The particular confidence of a person who has spent years inside a story they helped write, suddenly confronted with an audience that has read the original. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that the room would have accepted. Dennis Holt's resignation was processed 2 days later. Natalie forwarded the complete file to the regulatory body that had handled the original Vantex investigation, with a cover letter noting that new documentation had come to light in the course of a standard acquisition review. She did not call Ryan to tell him. She sent a message short, factual the way she communicated things that mattered. It's been submitted. Thank you. Ryan read it, standing at his kitchen sink, rinsing the breakfast dishes, while Emma got ready for school in the bathroom down the hall. He read it twice, then he set his phone down and finished the dishes. He had expected to feel something larger, the satisfaction of a verdict, or the particular vindication of being proven right after a long time of being defined as wrong. What he felt instead was quieter than that. Something releasing rather than arriving. The sensation of a weight that had been shifted from hand to hand for 4 years, being finally correctly set down. He drove Emma to school. She talked the whole way about a book she was reading in which a girl discovered a hidden door in her grandmother's house. And Ryan listened. And it was the most ordinary morning he could remember in a long time. The following weekend, Natalie called again. A senior consulting engineer position has been re-established in the new operational model, she said. I'd like to send you a formal offer. Ryan was sitting on the front steps of number 7 with a cup of coffee watching the maple tree at the edge of the driveway. It had gone fully red in the past week, the kind of color that looked like it was lit from inside. Thank you, he said. But no, a beat on her end. You don't want your career back. I want my life back, Ryan said. I think I'm getting that without adding a new job to it. Another stretch of quiet. When Natalie spoke again, something in her voice had shifted. Less the register of a professional transaction, more the register of a person trying to find the right footing for something they didn't have a practiced script for. Is there anything I can actually do, she said carefully, that would be useful? Ryan thought about it honestly, the way she had asked it honestly. Emma's school is short on equipment, he said. Her classroom has 2 computers that broke last semester. I've been meaning to fix them, but the parts cost more than the school can spend. I'll take care of it. She did within 3 days. 2 refurbished computers correctly configured for the classroom's existing network, delivered and installed by a technician who showed up on time and left without making a production of it. Emma came home that Friday, with a drawing a computer, with stick legs running down a school hallway, captioned in her handwriting, "They work now." She placed it on the kitchen table in front of Ryan, with the gravity of someone submitting an official report. He put it on the refrigerator. November settled over Hartwell Street, the way it always did, gradually, without announcement, until one morning the cold was simply there, and had clearly been there long enough to feel permanent. The maple out front had dropped most of its leaves by the second week. Emma collected them on the way to the car each morning, selecting specific ones with criteria that Ryan never fully understood, but never questioned, pressing them between the pages of whatever book she happened to be carrying. Natalie began to appear in small ways that had no agenda attached to them. Ryan noticed her on her front steps some evenings, not looking at her phone, just looking at the street, at the light changing on the rooftops across the way. She left a coffee on the Miller's fence post one morning while Ryan was replacing a section of their gate latch, setting it down without ceremony, and walking back across the street before he had finished straightening up. He didn't call after her. He drank the coffee when it was still hot and didn't make a story of it. Emma noticed everything the way children noticed, things they had decided were important. She tracked Natalie's incremental acknowledgments with the methodical interest of a scientist, cataloging a new phenomenon. First, the nod from across the street, then the small wave, then the actual smile that Emma described to Ryan at dinner as being different from her regular face. She reported each development with the satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis was proving correct, though she had never stated the hypothesis aloud. Ryan didn't seek Natalie out. He didn't manufacture reasons to cross the street. But he stopped pretending he didn't see her, which turned out to be its own kind of movement. When they stood close enough to talk, they talked carefully at first, and then, with an ease that surprised him more than it probably should have. She wasn't warm in the conventional sense. She was precise. She listened the way engineers listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually tracking the load-bearing points of what was being said. He found himself trusting that quality in a way he hadn't trusted much of anything for a long time. She asked about the work he did not, with the polite detachment of someone making conversation, but with the focused interest of someone who wanted to understand how a system actually functioned. He told her about the furnace on Maple he'd resurrected last winter, about the electrical panel at the restaurant on 5th, that the owner had been told needed full replacement, about the way most things that looked broken were actually just poorly understood. She listened to all of it without performing patience. He asked about her work in return, and she answered with the same directness, not the version she gave journalists, but the working version, the one that involved the specific texture of decisions made under uncertainty, and the particular loneliness of being the person in the room everyone was waiting on. He recognized that loneliness, though it had worn a different shape in his own life. They were, he was beginning to understand, more structurally similar than their addresses suggested. On a Thursday evening in the second week of November, just after 7, someone knocked on the door of number 7. Ryan turned off the stove the eggs could wait and went to answer it. Natalie stood on the porch. Not in the blazer and dark slacks she'd worn 6 weeks ago, not with the jaw-set urgency of a woman who had exhausted every other option. This was different, softer at the edges, in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. She was wearing a dark coat over a soft sweater, her hair down, and she was holding a covered pot with both hands, with the careful grip of someone unaccustomed to carrying things this way. Not because the pot was heavy, but because the act of bringing it mattered, and she didn't want to get it wrong. On her face was something Ryan had no prior category for. Not the controlled composure of the boardroom, not the stripped-bare urgency of that first rainy night. Something quieter than either the expression of a person standing voluntarily at the edge of something unfamiliar and choosing not to step back. "I made soup," she said. Then, after a moment, "It took 3 attempts." Ryan looked at the pot. He looked at her. "I realized," Natalie continued, in the voice of someone trying very hard to sound more composed than she was, "that I don't know how to do simple things. cook a meal, sit at a table without an agenda. She adjusted her grip on the pot slightly. I want to learn. I thought maybe you'd be willing to show me. From somewhere down the hallway came the sound of small feet, on hardwood, unhurried, unself-conscious. Emma appeared in the entryway in her pajamas, a book tucked under one arm, blinking at the woman on the porch with the frank assessment of someone for whom politeness had never been more interesting than accuracy. She looked at the pot. "Is that soup?" Emma asked. "It is," Natalie said. Emma considered this for a moment. "Does it need to be fixed?" Something came out of Natalie, then quick and unguarded, a sound that didn't belong to any version of her that had ever been quoted in a financial publication. It was a laugh, short, genuine, entirely unmanaged. The first thing Ryan had ever heard from her that she hadn't decided to say first. "Maybe a little," she admitted. "Dad can fix it," Emma said with the certainty of someone stating a known fact about a reliable law of the universe. She turned back down the hallway. "Come inside. We're eating dinner." Natalie looked at Ryan. He opened the door wider, and she stepped in out of the November cold, carrying the pot and the uncertainty and the particular quiet courage of someone who had learned recently, and at some cost, that simple things were not the same as small things. The door closed behind her. The porch light stayed on. From inside came the sounds of a dinner, beginning bowls on the table, the low register of a father's voice, the bright thread of a child's laughter, and underneath it, carefully, the sound of someone learning what it meant to belong somewhere.